Hi everyone, this is a quick video on week 6 of the class, and it's going to concern SOPs, and it's going to cover a few things that you should keep in mind when you are writing your SOP. We are currently looking at the Canvas page for week 6, and I just want to quickly go through some of the things that are going to come up this week. There's a short chapter on writing instructions from Markel. It's an abridged version of a much longer chapter actually, but I think it's something like 12 pages, not particularly long. And please also read this quick guide for writing effective instructions. We will glance at that in this video today. There is a discussion this week. The discussion should address these sample SOPs posted right here. It is worth noting that not all of these are great. Just give you a quick look forward. This one and this one and this one. Samples 1, 2, and 3 are all not particularly good. They are anonymous. I do not know where they came from. I don't know the students that they came from. Rather, they were given to me by a former instructor. They are nonetheless good examples of some things that can go wrong with SOP writing. Sample 4 and sample 5 are both better. These are both students that I had, and they both did a pretty good job with this. They're not perfect, but they're good SOPs. The discussion this week is to look at these and point out some things that could be better, particularly with these first 3, and to point out some things that are good with the later ones. This video is going to give sort of a quick overview of some things you're going to want to keep in mind when you're writing the SOP, and I want to turn to some documents that cover SOP writing. First one is this EPA guidelines document. It talks about SOP structure and what the goal of an SOP is. I'm not going to read a lot of it, not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I do want to talk about just some of the highlights. It is worth noting near the beginning of this, they say something that applies to our class as well. They say the term SOP may not always be appropriate, and terms such as protocols, instructions, worksheets, laboratory operating procedures may also be used. I would add to that field guides or instructional articles are fine too. Not all of you are doing a strict SOP in the traditional sense, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. A lot of the same concerns will apply regardless of what sort of project you're doing. It does have a little tidbit on writing styles. They should be concise, they should be step-by-step and easy to read. The information should be unambiguous. I want to focus on that word for just a second. This does not just mean unclear, it means capable of being understood in multiple different ways. That is a bad moment in a set of instructions. If you write something and it could be interpreted in a way that you do not mean, that can lead the user astray, and it can lead to disaster. It's also worth noting that the term "you" should not be used but implied. When you are writing these instructions, you should use what's called the imperative voice or the command voice. You should say, do this, now do this, not you should do this and you should do that. There are a few exceptions to the word "you." I've seen moments where I could not think of any better way to say it than using the word "you." An example that comes to mind is if you were telling a user to enter your password. It would be really awkward to say enter the user's password or potentially unclear. So there's not a total ban on the word "you," but normally this should be these documents should be in command voice, and you should not be making suggestions, and you should get in the habit of telling the user what to do. Let me address this moment quickly. SOP should be written with sufficient detail so that someone with limited experience or with knowledge of the procedure, but with a basic understanding, can successfully reproduce the procedure when unsupervised. I want to point out here that they are saying someone with limited experience, not absolutely no experience. Sometimes students misunderstand this assignment as being a set of instructions for somebody who has no idea what they're doing at all. You can presume a little bit of expertise or prior training on the part of the user, and in fact one of the goals of an SOP is that it will specify the prior training that a person has before they start doing the activity. You can expect that, say, a user knows how to use a screwdriver, for instance, or that a user is capable of using like some common tools. It's not that sort of strange assignment that's writing to somebody as if they have no idea what they're doing. Moving on down through the document, they do mention a little bit about checklists. These can often be attached to an SOP, and they can be a nice addition. Often they're included in an appendix, and they can be copied and put next to like the work area where it takes place. They do have this note. I want to read it just to highlight it. Remember that the checklist is not the SOP, but a part of the SOP. That is an important thing to read. I have had some students misunderstand that, and they have turned in extremely short SOPs that are just essentially a one-page checklist. checklist. Your document needs to be a minimum around 3 or 4 pages long. It can include a checklist as part of it, but that's not the sole thing that we're writing about. Now, for the scope of document that we're doing, I don't know if we necessarily need a table of contents. I think that's maybe a little bit overkill, but you will find SOPs that have them. We will look at one shortly. They have some guidelines for SOPs. This document is posted on Canvas. You can read through it. I think it's generally a good set of guidelines. I want to quickly go through some of the stuff that they say the SOP should include. They want you to include the procedures, obviously, and the following topics may be appropriate for inclusion in technical SOPs. Not all will apply to every procedure or work process being detailed. I read that partly because it's important to note some students have tried to pack in every single item on this list, and sometimes it leads to kind of a cluttered SOP. You may not need everything. One thing I will say you definitely do need is a statement of scope. The SOP definitely needs a statement of scope and applicability. This should explain what the SOP does. It should be a literal self-referential statement that says something like, this document describes how to, and so forth. It should define the purpose of the document. Importantly, if you're writing about something that is part of a bigger overall procedure, then you would want to point out that the document maybe doesn't cover certain steps that are applicable to the big picture view, but are not included in your particular document. This is a very normal thing for SOPs to do. They will say this document covers such and such section of the procedure. For the steps that are necessary prior to this, see SOP number 542 or whatever. There will be some reference to some other document. You're going to want to clarify up front what the SOP does and what it does not tell the user how to do. There should be health and safety warnings, and there should be cautions. These will come at the beginning of the document and then quite often at the point in the document where they are relevant. Do not overdo the health and safety warnings. Occasionally students will have way too many of these. There will be the same exact warning on every single page of the document, and at a certain point a user is just going to start tuning that out. It's an ineffective strategy. The convention is that near the beginning of the document you will address any health and safety concerns, and then wherever it becomes relevant within the document you'll bring it up once, maybe twice, but not 10 to 15 times. It's that becomes self-defeating. Cautions as well. There's a distinction between a safety warning and a caution. Caution essentially warns the user about damaging the equipment or doing something that could ruin the overall process, whereas health and safety warnings are, well, obviously meant to protect safety. They should be bolded in some way, and they should draw the user's attention to them. Interferences might be a worthwhile thing to put in if there's something that could potentially ruin the overall procedure, or something that comes up quite often that's a challenge. That could be a good thing to say at the beginning of the document. There should also perhaps in some cases be a set of personnel qualifications. If somebody needs some prior training before they start doing the thing that you're explaining, please put a note about that up front. Often there's a sort of statement on the expected skill level of the user, and that will describe any specific skills the person should have. Importantly, there needs to be a list of equipment and supplies. You want to tell the user what he or she is going to need before they start actually doing the document. And then there's actually going to be the procedure itself, where you talk about all of the things that you're asking the user to do. It should be orderly, it should be labeled, it should be concise and unambiguous, and those are the basic parts of the SOP. In case I'm not being clear, this bit right here where it says procedure, that's the bulk of the document. Let's say, if you're writing 4 pages, about 2.5 to 3 of them ought to be just pure procedures. A lot of this stuff, though, does come up in the beginning of the document. Let's look at an example really quickly. So there are several examples of SOPs posted on Canvas. This is probably the biggest and most complex of all of them. It is from the state of California, and it is on testing samples for lead contamination. And it is worth noting that they start off with a really extensive scope statement and a number of other little sections before they actually get into the instructions. So we have a statement of scope. When we're saying statement of scope, it is exactly this. This document details analysis of lead and chromium by atomic absorption spectrophotometry. That is telling you the purpose of the document, and they have several additions to that purpose. I am not going to read through them all in this video. But you can see it is quite an extensive list of statements about what the document should accomplish. They do have a quick summary of the method, what they're asking users to do in this, and they're describing it, giving a sort of a look forward. They have a list of the necessary materials to complete it. That's section 3. They have a list of the necessary chemicals. They have a list warning about various different interferences. They have a section listing more interferences and even more interferences. They divide these into 3 different sections. Again, I am not going to read through all of this in the video, but it is worth noting just the sheer size of these opening sections. It is not until section 9, a full 4 or 5 pages into the list of instructions, that they start actually telling the user to do anything. The first set of instructions, where there's an actual command, comes here in 9.1. Quickly, we can acknowledge the way this is structured. They're telling the user how to wash bottles, and they're explaining a certain method of creating a nitric acid solution for washing these bottles. This structure, where they've got in 9.1 and then they subdivide that into numerous other steps, 9.1.1, 9.1.2, and so forth. This is a normal thing you will see in SOPs. It is also one of the reasons that the decimal system is often preferred, particularly in scientific laboratory SOPs. Like laboratory specific SOPs tend to adopt this decimal system quite often. It does have the advantage of being easily divisible. If there's some step that you feel is a little bit more complex and you need to map out some of the sub-steps of it, that's totally fine. I do want to quickly warn against making too many subdivisions. If there is one problem I have seen students have more than any other with SOP writing, it is making too many divisions. They divide up every single little individual step to the point where it becomes like kind of a confusing, cluttered document. For instance, the student might go 9.1.1 and then they'll have another section called 9.1.1.1 or 0.2 and so forth, whatever. And that is not necessary, and it's not necessarily good practice. Also, it is worth noting that when they are actually explaining the tasks, they are feeling at liberty to use several lines of text to explain a series of actions. Nothing is wrong with that. You do not have to have every little command be like a short, very tight, minimal sentence. You can have 3 or 4 sentences to explain a series of actions. It is also worth noting that they divide up the actions into various different subsections. So section 9 is on cleaning the bottles, section 10 is on extraction reagent and rinse solution preparation, and it goes on. This is a really technical one. It is on Canvas. You can look through it if you want. We're not going to be reading a great deal of it, more than I already have right here, but I just want to point out kind of how a professional SOP looks. This is a big hefty one that is actually used in labs, and I'll stress it again, there is nothing wrong with doing the subdivision thing, but do not overdo it. It can be done a little bit too much. There's like I said, a few good sample SOPs. I want to turn to one right now. This is a slightly minimalist one, but it's pretty good. It does the job. There's times when I wish it said a little bit more, had a little bit more content, but if you're looking for like a pretty solid example of a good SOP, this one from a former student named Amanda, standard operating procedure for making and loading a 1% agarose gel for gel electrophoresis. I am going to take just a moment to read a couple of short sections of this to point out what the student is doing well. So first things first, the purpose and scope is exactly what it should be. This document lists all the necessary steps to make a 1% agarose gel, to load the gel with sample DNA, and to run the gel. Next item, this document does not give instructions on how to do PCR reactions, which are usually done prior to gel electrophoresis. That statement is important. This is when we say define the scope. This is exactly what she's doing, and it's what you should do. Like, clarify what the document does and what it does not do. It's worth noting that if we were to be picky, she probably ought to explain what PCR means, or explain the full terminology of that, polymerase chain reaction, I believe. That's something that ought to be come up for the sake of thoroughness, but it is nonetheless a pretty good set of statements. This method is being used in biological laboratories to measure the lengths of sample DNA DNA against the DNA of a standard length. This standard is often referred to as a ladder. Now, I should say, I think the student probably could have said quite a bit more here in this purpose and scope section. She could have described the process a little bit more. She could have described some of the necessary training to do the procedure, but overall, this is pretty good, and it's what's expected. She has a list of materials. I will not read through it, obviously. That's super boring, but it is thorough. It does include everything that is needed. So that's good. Let me quickly move down to two sections of the actual instructions. It's worth noting there is a little tiny mistake here. We've got section 3, and this first step really should be labeled 3.1, and instead she skipped that, and it's 3.2. I will forgive that. It is a good SOP overall. I just want to quickly read the very first tangible step of this SOP. While wearing gloves, weigh out 0.5 grams of agarose into a clean 200 milliliter flask. The reason I read that is I want to point out a temptation that has quite often gotten the better of students. They would see this, wearing gloves, as needing its own particular step. So a lot of students might write the SOP, step 1, put on gloves. Step 2, weigh out 0.5 grams of agarose. I think the student made a very good choice by doing this. And what I'm getting at is she is condensing the information here and there, and she's writing to people who can understand this simple statement while wearing gloves. The problem I see a lot of students have is they will over-divide. They will make every little particular action into its own step, and sometimes that leads to a really cluttered document. She does have the cautions highlighted. This really should be a warning, not caution. Again, there's a distinction here. It's talked about in the textbook chapter. Warning involves safety. Caution involves, not damaging the equipment. But, overall, again, this is a pretty good document. She has a couple of visual aids. Your SOP needs visual aids as well. Let's note some things that she's doing well. We get a label, figure 1, and then we get a pretty extensive caption explaining what it is that we are looking at. This bit right here is necessary. Do not include pictures that do not have a label and caption. It is part of the assignment. It is part of technical writing in general. If you're going to include a visual, make sure it's usable, make sure it has a label, and make sure it has an explanatory caption. I want to look at one other quick section of this. She's got another visual down here. That's pretty good, but it's not the thing I'm trying to get to. So step 4.7 is a section where she does kind of subdivide the steps. So we've got pipette 5, I believe that's microliters of KB DNA ladder into the first well of the gel using the following method and referring to figure 2. Now she subdivides that into these steps. 4.71, with the ladder already loaded in the pipette tip, place both elbows on the table, hold the pipette with both hands, and look down on the well in the gel electrophoresis chamber. Lower the tip into the middle of the first well and slowly pipette the ladder into the well by pushing down all the way in the pipette piston. Without releasing the piston, wait a couple of seconds for all of the sample to settle into the well. Gently pull the pipette out of the chamber, release the pipette piston, and eject the tip. I read all of that to point out that it is just good, clear, straightforward writing. One of the reasons this got an A, and it's not perfect, but it is pretty good, and one of the reasons for that is that it's just well written. She's got an authoritative, clear voice. The instructions are generally concise, not super stripped down to the point where they're hard to understand, but also definitely not wordy. It is more or less a very well-written document. This one is on Canvas. It's one of the ones I'm asking you all to look at and discuss this week. There is one other document I want to look at in this video. We are almost done. I want to point out this document. I'm on our Canvas page, and it says Quick Guide for Writing Effective Instructions. That document looks like this. So these are the requirements that you should have in mind. This document should be open on your computer as you're writing the SOP, just to make sure you're not missing any of these and that you're kind of aware of what the assignment includes. There should be a statement of purpose. There should be a statement of scope. Describe what the document does, what it's for, and importantly, what it does not do. Definitely include the list of necessary materials and a list of necessary equipment. It is worth noting that it right here condensed if appropriate appropriate. The reason I bring that up, I've had a few students who have written equipment lists that are several pages long, and it's because they are literally listing everything, like every single size of ratchet and every single size of screwdriver and every single size of wrench and so forth, and it just ends up being this huge cluttered list that nobody's actually going to read through. There are times when you could say, basic mechanic toolkit, and you will do the job. So keep in mind, this does not need to be utterly comprehensive. You can condense here or there. Do make sure that there's a formatted list of steps. The decimal system is preferred. It's not the only option, but it does have some real advantages to it. It doesn't ever repeat itself. It is easily subdivisable. I don't like Roman numerals. I've seen SOPs use them occasionally. They're not off limits, but I do tend to think they're not as effective as using a decimal system. Don't overlook stuff that has become second nature. Remember, you're writing to somebody who's often training with these SOPs, so you want to make sure you're covering the topic thoroughly. Get in the habit of using command imperative voice. Don't say you should. Instead, just tell the user what to do. Try to use parallelism. Parallelism is a concept in which you use a similar type of language to convey comparable ideas. This is an example of really bad parallelism. This is an example of good parallelism. I will not read it out loud. I will leave it to you to read through that, but try to make your instructions parallel, so they're kind of using like a similar set of commands. And also on that note, make sure that your vocabulary is consistent, that you're not switching up the words you're using to call certain things, whatever you're calling them. Use typography consistently. There's nothing wrong with bold, there's nothing wrong with italics, but you do want to be consistent with it. Also, a quick word of caution to anybody that is doing something that involves a user looking at a screen. If you are using a word that you want the user to either type in or click on the screen, make sure you are doing some sort of typographical signal that is the word that should appear on the screen. For instance, quotation marks around it, or possibly bold would be acceptable. If you're asking the user to press enter, then enter should be bolded, underlined possibly, something like that to draw attention to it. So in the overall document, it looks a little bit different than the language surrounding it. This item here, use white space wisely. It's sort of like an easy thing to say and sometimes a hard thing to judge, but what that means is don't clutter up the document and also don't spread it out too much. Use the caution and warning labels where relevant, make them obvious, and I don't know if I'll read the rest of these. Yeah, maybe we should quickly say page numbers are a very good thing. Numerals are usually better than words for numbers. If you're typing that 42, that's going to be an easier thing for a reader's eye to spot than the word typed out 42. Try to keep it concise. Try to be straightforward with the language, and try to have a sense of authority about the document. If you have questions along the way while writing this document, please feel free to get hold of me. I can look at sections of them if you're struggling with it, and if you have any questions about the overall assignment or the overall project, let me know. Also keep in mind that you need to get this SOP written very quickly because we need to fit in time to test the document. That's going to be the next phase of the class. After we finish writing the SOP, you need to have somebody else use it and test it, and so we've got to get a draft done this week or early next week in order to accomplish that and finish up the overall project. So again, get hold of me if you have questions about anything. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep in touch.